A tunnel boring machine talks to you through its cutterhead, if you've spent enough years running one to feel the difference between ground that's holding and ground that's about to change on you. I've operated tunnel boring machines for 19 years, the last 8 of them as lead operator for Castellane Underground on transit and utility tunnel projects, and the specific thing that's kept every person on my crew alive across those years is trusting the torque and vibration signature coming back through my own hands over any prediction on a screen. Because the ground ahead of a machine like this doesn't announce itself to a borehole sample taken 40 meters away nearly as clearly as it announces itself to a cutterhead actually chewing through it in real time. My name is Anders Reyes. My mother-in-law, Odette, is Castellane Underground's chief geotechnical officer, the woman who spent the last 3 years building and championing GroundSync, a geological prediction platform that interpolates ground conditions ahead of every active tunnel boring machine using borehole samples taken at intervals along the planned route, installed across every project the company runs. This is a story about Odette, about a system she genuinely believed had solved one of tunneling's oldest problems, knowing what you're about to bore through before you actually hit it, and about a March morning when GroundSync's smooth, confident prediction showed unremarkable clay soil ahead of my machine, while a fault line sitting entirely between 2 sampled boreholes told a very different story to anyone reading the cutterhead directly. GroundSync came online across Castellane Underground's active projects 3 years ago, a platform built to interpolate geological conditions between widely spaced borehole samples, using the specific composition, density, and water table data from each sampled point to model the likely ground conditions in between, a genuinely difficult problem that had, before GroundSync, relied entirely on an operator's own real-time read of the machine's behavior combined with borehole data that was often the only advance information available at all. My mother-in-law had pushed hard for the system from its earliest proposal, arguing, correctly, that boreholes alone, sampled every 100 meters or more along a planned tunnel route for cost reasons, left enormous stretches of genuinely unknown ground between them, and that a well-built interpolation model could meaningfully narrow that uncertainty for crews planning their advance rates and support systems. GroundSync doesn't just connect 2 boreholes with a straight line, Anders, she told me, more than once, across a family dinner table I'd been eating at since I married her daughter, it models the geological trends between sample points using regional formation data and the specific characteristics found at each borehole. That's a genuinely more sophisticated picture than tunnel crews had access to for generations before this system existed. I don't doubt the interpolation's more sophisticated than a straight line between 2 points, Odette. What I'm telling you is that any interpolation, however sophisticated, is still built on an assumption that conditions change gradually between sampled points, and I've felt this machine hit ground that changed anything but gradually, in a pattern that doesn't show up as a trend at all. It shows up as a sudden discontinuity. A smooth model has no way to predict if neither borehole on either side of it happened to sit close enough to catch it. I want to be fair to what GroundSync actually got right, because this isn't a story about a system built carelessly, or a mother-in-law who'd stopped caring about the crews working underground the moment she moved from field geology into a technology leadership role. GroundSync's interpolated predictions had genuinely improved advanced planning and support system selection across dozens of tunnel segments over 3 years, exactly the kind of careful, defensible engineering Odette had built her second career on after 18 years herself as a field geologist before joining Castellane's leadership team, and I never once doubted she believed in it completely. Right down to personally reviewing every geological surprise report the system's dashboard generated. What the system didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the danger of, was any way to detect a sharp geological fault line sitting entirely within the gap between 2 sampled boreholes, a discontinuity that, by definition, no interpolation model built from those 2 sample points alone could ever predict, because both boreholes on either side of that exact fault could show entirely normal, consistent clay soil, giving the model every reason to interpolate a smooth, unremarkable transition directly through a zone that, in physical reality, contained a sudden and genuinely hazardous change in ground conditions. Odette had been the one who first taught me to read a torque gauge properly, years before I ever married her daughter, back when I was a green operator on my very first project and she was still a field geologist walking the tunnel face herself several times a week. I remembered her crouching beside a core sample table more than once, turning a fractured piece of rock over in her hands, explaining exactly what each striation and discoloration meant about the ground it had come from, a patience and precision I recognized instantly, all these years later, in the same careful engineering she'd poured into ground sink itself. I think that shared history was part of why our disagreement over the system's blind spot never once felt, to either of us, like a fight about whether she'd built something worth trusting. I need to explain the specific hazard this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened that March morning, and because it's exactly the kind of geological reality an interpolation model, built specifically to estimate what's happening between two known points, was never designed to catch when the things sitting between those points broke the very assumption the interpolation depended on. The tunnel segment my crew was boring that March ran beneath an area with a documented history of minor seismic activity decades earlier, activity that had, we later confirmed, left behind a narrow but genuinely significant fault zone, a stretch of fractured, water-bearing ground sitting almost exactly midway between two boreholes drilled roughly 120 meters apart during the project's original geological survey, both of which had come back showing consistent, unremarkable clay. GroundSync's model, working entirely from those two consistent readings, interpolated a smooth, gradual clay profile across the full 120 meters between them, giving my crew every reason, on paper, to expect an unremarkable advance through that entire stretch. I'd raised a version of this exact concern with Odette nearly 10 months before this story's events, after a training review of the region's documented seismic history had reminded me how narrow and how easily missed a fault zone like this could be by any survey method that only sampled at fixed intervals rather than continuously along the route. GroundSync's interpolation is statistically validated against dozens of completed tunnel segments, Anders. The model's shown strong accuracy connecting borehole pairs across every project we've run it on so far. I understand it's been accurate on average, Odette. What I'm telling you is that accurate on average doesn't protect against the one specific gap between two boreholes that happens to contain a real fault line neither borehole caught, because by definition, a discontinuity sitting entirely between two sample points is invisible to any model built purely from those 2 points. I want a standing protocol requiring continuous seismic profiling along any route with documented regional fault history, not just interpolation between the original borehole spacing, before we commit a machine to an unmonitored advance through ground like that. That's a significant additional survey cost across every project touching documented seismic zones, and I can't authorize that scale of expense based on a theoretical gap rather than an actual discrepancy we've encountered in the field. I remember leaving her office that evening understanding exactly where Odette was standing, even as I disagreed with the conclusion she'd reached from there. She'd spent 18 years in the field before she ever sat behind a title like Chief Geotechnical Officer, and I knew, better than almost anyone at the company, how many blind advances she'd personally lived through in an era before any interpolation model existed at all. Crews pushing forward through genuinely unknown ground with nothing but a borehole log from months earlier and whatever the machine itself happened to tell them in the moment. She wasn't wrong that GroundSync's average accuracy across dozens of segments represented a real, meaningful improvement over that older reality, and I wasn't wrong that average accuracy said nothing at all about the one specific segment where the ground itself broke the model's core assumption. The genuine difficulty was that a theoretical gap, described in a training review rather than an actual incident report, was never going to carry the same weight in a budget conversation as a documented failure, and I didn't yet have the second thing to put in front of her, only the first. The morning this story turns on was the second week of March, my crew roughly 60 meters into the 120-meter stretch between the two boreholes, GroundSync's dashboard showing a continued, unremarkable clay profile for the remaining advance, consistent with what both boreholes on either end of the segment had originally sampled. I was in the operator's cab monitoring the cutterhead's torque and vibration readouts, a habit I'd never once dropped across 19 years regardless of what any predictive model showed, when I felt it, a sudden, sharp increase in torque fluctuation paired with a specific grinding vibration signature I recognized instantly from two previous fault zone encounters earlier in my career, a pattern that read, unmistakably, as fractured, unstable ground directly ahead, nothing like the smooth clay. GroundSync's dashboard continued to display. Ground control, this is Anders, I'm reading a sharp torque and vibration anomaly at the cutterhead, doesn't match the clay profile ground sinks showing. I'm halting the advance until we get eyes on what's actually ahead of this machine. Ground sinks showing consistent clay the whole remaining stretch, Anders, nothing flagged on the interpolated profile. I know exactly what the model's showing, and I'm telling you what this machine is telling me right now through my own hands. A torque signature like this one has meant fractured, water-bearing ground both times I've felt it before in my career, and I'm not advancing another meter until we've confirmed what's actually in front of this cutter head. I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell squarely within my formal authority as lead operator and, honestly, within the one rule every operator on this crew has followed since long before ground sink existed, that an unexplained anomaly in cutter head torque or vibration halts advance immediately, full stop, regardless of what any predictive model displayed elsewhere on the console. I called a full halt on the machine's advance, requested an emergency probe drilling crew to core directly ahead of the cutter head before committing to another meter, a request that added roughly 6 hours to the day's schedule and that I'd made perhaps 3 times across 19 years, always on shifts that felt exactly like this one. My relief operator, a careful, steady woman named Priyanka who'd worked this exact machine alongside me for 4 years, backed the halt without hesitation the moment I described the torque signature to her, the particular instinct of someone who'd absorbed the same fundamental caution this crew had been raised on regardless of how much predictive modeling now sat between us and the ground itself. The probe drilling crew set up within the hour, coring directly ahead of the cutter head's planned path, and I stood at the tunnel face with Priyanka watching the core samples come up, both of us quiet, waiting to find out which one of us had actually been reading the ground correctly that morning. The waiting itself carried its own particular weight, 6 hours of a halted machine and a crew standing idle while the drill worked its slow way forward, the specific tension of knowing that if the core came back clean, I'd have cost the project half a day's advance on nothing more than a torque reading and 2 decades-old memories of a different fault zone entirely, and knowing that if it didn't come back clean, the alternative was a machine that had very nearly bored straight into fractured water-bearing ground with nobody topside aware anything was wrong until it already had. I found myself running my thumb along the edge of the core log clipboard more than once in those 6 hours, a habit I hadn't noticed in myself since the last time this exact torque signature had shown up years earlier on a different project entirely. The probe drilling found it roughly 3 hours in, a fractured, water-bearing fault zone beginning almost exactly where my torque anomaly had first registered, running considerably deeper than either original borehole had sampled, a genuine seismic fault sitting entirely within the gap ground sinks model had confidently interpolated as smooth, unremarkable clay. That's not a gradual transition anybody's interpolation was ever going to catch, Anders, Priyanka said, holding up a fractured core sample still dark with groundwater. Both boreholes on either side of this thing came back clean because neither one happened to land inside the fault zone itself. The model did exactly what it was built to do, connect 2 clean readings smoothly. It just had no way to know the ground between them wasn't actually smooth. That's the whole problem I've been trying to explain to Odette for 10 months, Priyanka. The model's genuinely good at interpolating between 2 points, it's just never going to catch the one thing sitting entirely between them that neither point happened to sample. I photographed the core samples and the full torque anomaly log myself, requested an emergency geotechnical assessment of the fault zone's full extent before authorizing any further advance, and called my mother-in-law directly rather than waiting for the report to reach her through the normal chain. Odette drove out to the site herself that afternoon, having pulled ground sink's original interpolated profile and cross-referenced it against the probe drilling results the moment word reached her office that my crew had halted in advance based on a torque anomaly the model had never flagged, and I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with a genuine fault zone sitting in hardcore samples in front of both our eyes. A fault zone sitting entirely between 2 clean borehole readings, Anders. That's not a marginal miss. That's the exact scenario you've been describing to me for 10 months, sitting right here where I can finally see the core samples myself instead of just hearing about a theoretical gap. I've been telling you a discontinuity between 2 sample points is invisible to any model built purely from those points, Odette. I didn't have anything beyond a training review and 2 earlier fault encounters in my career until this morning made the gap impossible to keep deferring. This wasn't the system malfunctioning. It was the system doing exactly what interpolation does, connecting 2 clean readings smoothly, in exactly the one scenario where smooth was never actually true. Which is exactly the gap I need to sit with, and I know that now in a way I genuinely didn't let myself believe 10 months ago, when you first raised it at that dinner. I wasn't dismissing you because I'd stopped trusting your judgment, Anders. I spent 18 years as a field geologist watching crews advance blind through ground nobody had sampled closely enough, and I built GroundSync because I genuinely believed a well-validated interpolation model closed that gap meaningfully. I think I let myself believe strong average accuracy across dozens of segments was the same thing as safety in every individual segment, right up until this morning showed me a fault zone sitting exactly where two clean readings could never have caught it. I know that, Odette. I'm not angry at you for wanting to close a gap that's cost this industry real close calls for generations. I've heard your stories about tunnels you worked before any of this technology existed. I'm telling you that the one time it mattered, a confident clay profile was asking this whole crew to trust a model that could never have shown them what was actually sitting between two boreholes that happened to land on either side of exactly the wrong stretch of ground. She was quiet for a long moment, looking down the tunnel toward the halted cutterhead, and I watched her run the same calculation I imagined she'd been running since the core samples reached her, the particular geologist's math of how many other segments, across 3 years and however many documented seismic zones the company had tunneled through, might have carried the same invisible interpolation gap without one operator's torque reading instincts happening to catch it in time. I keep thinking about the version of this morning where you talked yourself out of halting the advance, because the dashboard showed clean clay the whole way and 6 hours of downtime is a real cost on a project this size, she said, finally, still looking down the dark tunnel, or the version where you'd stopped raising this at family dinners after I pushed back 10 months ago. Because I outranked the argument on paper even if I'd spent 18 years in the field myself before I ever sat behind a title. I don't like sitting with how much of this morning came down to you personally deciding a torque reading couldn't ever become optional, no matter how confident the model looked. I don't love sitting with that either, Odette. A system this good shouldn't need one operator's stubborn trust in his own hands as its last line of defense before a machine bores straight into fractured, water-bearing ground. That's not a compliment to me, it's a description of exactly the gap we both need to close. You built something genuinely good across 3 years, and I've never once told this crew otherwise, but genuinely good on average isn't the same as safe in every individual segment, and I think somewhere in the last 10 months you let yourself believe those were closer to the same thing than a fault line sitting invisibly between two clean boreholes ever should have let either of us assume. What Odette and I built together over the following months, working with the geotechnical team directly, was a standing protocol requiring continuous seismic profiling, rather than interpolation between fixed boreholes alone, for any route crossing documented regional fault history, closing the exact gap that had let 3 otherwise excellent years of interpolated geological modeling miss the one kind of hazard that, by its very nature, could sit entirely invisible between two clean sample points. I still trust my own hands on that cutterhead over any predictive dashboard, considerably less anxiously now that routes through seismic zones carry continuous profiling rather than a model's best guess at what's happening in between. Priyanka still brings up that March morning occasionally, over coffee in the site trailer, the particular 6-hour halt neither of us has ever needed to explain twice to anyone who's since heard the full story. Odette and I talk about GroundSync's ongoing refinement most Sundays now, over the same family dinner table I've been eating at since I married her daughter, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that March morning. She told me once that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't the new profiling protocol at all, it was sitting with how completely 3 clean years had let her trust an interpolation model's strong average accuracy as protection against a hazard that average accuracy, by definition, could never have caught. A tunnel boring machine talks to you through its cutterhead, if you've spent enough years running one to feel the difference, and what I've learned, watching a system my own mother-in-law built get this one thing wrong for 10 months before finally getting it right, is that the most dangerous gap in a genuinely well-built system is often the one sitting quietly inside the space between 2 points it was never actually able to see, no matter how confidently it draws the line connecting them. It took a fractured core sample, a 6-hour halt, and a mother-in-law and son-in-law who trusted each other enough to argue honestly across a family dinner table 10 months before it mattered, to finally close a gap that 3 otherwise excellent years of engineering had never quite found their way to on their own.